It didn't begin with a fight or a harsh word, it began with a birthday that passed quietly, the kind that makes you check the calendar twice just to be sure you didn't remember it wrong. And when the day ended without a call, you told yourself they were busy, that reminders fail, that life happens, and you went to bed pretending it didn't matter. A few days later you caught yourself replaying how birthdays used to sound, how one of them used to sing off-key just to make you laugh, how another insisted on blowing out candles that weren't theirs, and the contrast felt sharper than you expected. You didn't call to mention it, you didn't want to make it awkward, so you waited, and waiting felt easier at first, like patience, like love behaving itself. Weeks slipped by, and when a message finally came, it was short and cheerful, full of emojis but light on words, and you smiled at the screen longer than necessary, as if the warmth might last if you held it there. The next visit was quick, coats still on, conversations hopping from one topic to another, and you noticed how one grandchild kept checking their phone while nodding along, not rude, just elsewhere, and that detail stayed with you long after they left. When the door closed, the house didn't feel empty exactly, it felt paused, like it was waiting for something that wasn't scheduled anymore. After that, you became more aware of the gaps, not dramatically, just quietly, counting time without meaning to, noticing how you were always the one who remembered first, who hesitated longest before reaching out. You started asking yourself small questions, practical ones, like whether calling now would be welcome or inconvenient, whether sending another message would feel warm or unnecessary, and those questions changed how your days felt. You remembered how they once ran toward you without thinking, how your presence never needed an invitation, and now everything seemed to require timing, coordination, permission. Nothing was wrong on the surface, and that was part of the problem, because there was nothing to fix, nothing to apologize for, just a slow rearranging of importance that no one announced. You didn't feel pushed away, you felt moved aside, and there's a difference that's harder to explain but easier to feel. The next missed moment was smaller, almost forgettable, a school event you heard about afterward, a story told in passing that you weren't part of, and it landed heavier than the birthday had. You began to realize this wasn't about a single call or visit, it was about presence, about whether you still existed in their lives between updates. You told yourself this is how it's supposed to go, that growing up means growing outward, but that explanation didn't stop the quiet shift happening inside you, the one where you began to wonder how many moments would pass before someone noticed you weren't there. You weren't looking for constant attention, you weren't asking to be central again, you just wanted to feel included without effort, remembered without reminders. And as that thought settled, another followed close behind, one you hadn't allowed yourself to consider before, but couldn't ignore now. If this distance continues without anyone naming it, what exactly will be left of the closeness you're still carrying so carefully? It didn't begin with a fight or a harsh word, it began with a birthday that passed quietly, the kind that makes you check the calendar twice just to be sure you didn't remember it wrong. And when the day ended without a call, you told yourself they were busy, that reminders fail, that life happens, and you went to bed pretending it didn't matter. A few days later you caught yourself replaying how birthdays used to sound, how one of them used to sing off-key just to make you laugh, how another insisted on blowing out candles that weren't theirs, and the contrast felt sharper than you expected. You didn't call to mention it, you didn't want to make it awkward, so you waited, and waiting felt easier at first, like patience, like love behaving itself. Weeks slipped by, and when a message finally came, it was short and cheerful, full of emojis but light on words, and you smiled at the screen longer than necessary, as if the warmth might last if you held it there. The next visit was quick, coats still on, conversations hopping from one topic to another, and you noticed how one grandchild kept checking their phone while nodding along, not rude, just elsewhere, and that detail stayed with you long after they left. When the door closed, the house didn't feel empty exactly, it felt paused, like it was waiting for something that wasn't scheduled anymore. After that, you became more aware of the gaps, not dramatically, just quietly, counting time without meaning to, noticing how you were always the one who remembered first, who hesitated longest before reaching out. You started asking yourself small questions, practical ones, like whether calling now would be welcome or inconvenient, whether sending another message would feel warm or unnecessary, and those questions changed how your days felt. You remembered how they once ran toward you without thinking, how your presence never needed an invitation, and now everything seemed to require timing, coordination, permission. Nothing was wrong on the surface, and that was part of the problem, because there was nothing to fix, nothing to apologize for, just a slow rearranging of importance that no one announced. You didn't feel pushed away, you felt moved aside, and there's a difference that's harder to explain but easier to feel. The next missed moment was smaller, almost forgettable, a school event you heard about afterward, a story told in passing that you weren't part of, and it landed heavier than the birthday had. You began to realize this wasn't about a single call or visit, it was about presence, about whether you still existed in their lives between updates. You told yourself this is how it's supposed to go, that growing up means growing outward. But that explanation didn't stop the quiet shift happening inside you, the one where you began to wonder how many moments would pass before someone noticed you weren't there. You weren't looking for constant attention, you weren't asking to be central again, you just wanted to feel included without effort, remembered without reminders. And as that thought settled, another followed close behind, one you hadn't allowed yourself to consider before, but couldn't ignore now. If this distance continues without anyone naming it, what exactly will be left of the closeness you're still carrying so carefully? The moment arrived on an ordinary day, which somehow made it harder to ignore, because nothing about it felt dramatic enough to justify the weight it carried. You had been thinking about calling all morning, not for any special reason, just because their name surfaced in your mind the way it used to when they were small and wandered off into another room. You told yourself you would call after lunch, then after the dishes were done, then after one more small task, until the day quietly moved past the point where calling felt natural. When you finally picked up the phone, you didn't dial right away, you stared at the screen, noticing how long it had been since you last reached out first, how the pattern had slowly formed without your permission. You imagined the conversation before it happened, the cheerful greeting, the polite questions, the moment where the energy might fade and you'd feel the need to wrap things up so they could get back to their life. That anticipation alone was enough to make you hesitate. You told yourself you didn't want to interrupt, didn't want to impose, didn't want to be one more obligation added to an already full day. And yet the longer you waited, the more that reasoning began to feel like a habit rather than a choice. When a message finally came later that evening, casual and friendly, mentioning a busy week and plans you hadn't heard about before, you felt relief and disappointment arrive together. Relief that you were remembered, disappointment that it took silence to make space for you. You noticed how you edited your reply, trimming anything that might invite a longer conversation, choosing words that sounded supportive rather than revealing, and that decision unsettled you more than the silence had. It made you realize how carefully you had learned to manage your presence, how much effort went into appearing easy to accommodate. The next interaction confirmed it wasn't just one day, it was a pattern, a rhythm where you responded quickly but initiated rarely, where you waited for openings instead of creating them, and that awareness brought a quiet discomfort you couldn't shake. You thought about how different this felt from the past, when reaching out required no strategy, when connection wasn't something you rehearsed internally before attempting. You weren't angry with them, but you felt a growing tension with yourself, a sense that by staying silent, you were participating in the distance you claimed to dislike. That realization pressed on you during a visit that followed soon after, one where everything was pleasant on the surface, laughter shared, updates exchanged, yet you felt a persistent urge to say something more honest hovering just beneath the conversation. Each time the moment seemed to open, you closed it again, afraid of changing the tone, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of confirming a fear you weren't ready to face. When they left, you stood by the door longer than usual, replaying the visit not for what was said, but for what wasn't, and the absence felt louder than any words could have been. You began to see that avoidance had its own cost, that by protecting everyone from discomfort, you were protecting no one from loss. The question shifted subtly but decisively, no longer asking whether you should speak up, but how long you could continue pretending that waiting felt the same as peace. You didn't know what saying something would change or if it would change anything at all, but you could no longer ignore the feeling that silence was shaping the outcome whether you approved of it or not. That awareness didn't arrive as a demand or a decision, it arrived as pressure, steady and insistent, the kind that builds quietly until doing nothing starts to feel more dangerous than doing something, and for the first time, you sensed that a choice was forming, one you wouldn't be able to postpone forever. The moment came during a visit that wasn't supposed to matter, the kind squeezed between other plans, short enough to feel manageable, casual enough to avoid expectations. You were sitting together at the table, cups cooling untouched, conversation drifting safely from one neutral topic to another. And for a while you told yourself this was fine, that presence alone counted even if it was brief. One grandchild leaned back in their chair, thumb moving absently over a phone screen, not hiding it, not being rude, just living in two places at once, and something about that small habit stayed with you longer than it should have. You waited, listening for an opening, not because you had planned a speech, but because something in you felt tired of always carrying the unsaid alone. When the conversation slowed, when there was a pause just wide enough to step into, you heard yourself say more clearly than you intended, I don't know when I stopped being part of your regular days, but I feel it now. The sentence hung there, not sharp, not loud, but different from anything you had said before. They looked up, surprised, not defensive, just caught off guard, and for a brief second you wondered if you had gone too far. Then came the response. Gentle explanations about busy schedules, about how quickly time moves, about how nothing was meant by the distance, and every word made sense. You nodded because you understood all of it, you always had, and that understanding was part of what made this harder. The conversation tried to return to its earlier ease, but it didn't quite succeed. Laughter arrived a beat late, eye contact broke sooner, and something fragile seemed to sit quietly between you, unaddressed but undeniable. You felt the urge to say more, to follow that sentence with another that explained how the waiting felt, how silence accumulates when no one names it, but you stopped yourself, afraid of sounding like you were asking for something they couldn't give, afraid of changing the way they saw you. When the visit ended, hugs exchanged, promises made in the familiar vague language of soon and next time, you stood in the doorway watching them leave, aware that something had shifted even if no one acknowledged it aloud. That evening you waited for a message that never came, not because you expected reassurance, but because the moment felt like it deserved acknowledgement. When days passed instead, the absence felt heavier than before, confirming that the sentence hadn't been forgotten, only absorbed without urgency. You noticed the change in yourself more than in them, how you replayed the visit less for what was said and more for what it altered, how reaching out again felt different now, no longer neutral. You had crossed a quiet line and there was no stepping back over it. The distance hadn't closed, but it had been exposed, and that exposure carried weight. You realized that hints and softness had taken you as far as they could, and that speaking partially had created a new tension you couldn't dissolve by pretending everything was fine again. This wasn't resolution, and it wasn't conflict either. It was something more unsettling, a pause where outcomes were still undecided. And as you moved through the days that followed, you felt the truth settle in with uncomfortable clarity. The next time you spoke, it wouldn't be a gentle observation slipped into conversation. It would be a choice, one that would either change the shape of the relationship or confirm the distance already forming, and either way silence would no longer protect you from the cost of being honest. After that visit, you tried to return to normal, not because it felt right but because normal was familiar and didn't require explanation. You answered messages warmly, kept your tone light, resisted the urge to follow up on what had been said, telling yourself that giving space was the respectful thing to do. When a call came, you didn't mention the silence that preceded it, and when days passed without contact, you convinced yourself it was better not to keep score. But something in that restraint began to feel less like patience and more like avoidance, especially when you noticed how quickly reassurance had become expected. One grandchild ended a call early with an easy excuse, promising to catch up later, and instead of acknowledging the disappointment you felt, you said, "No worries at all," a phrase that slipped out automatically, even though it no longer matched what you felt. That moment lingered not because of what they did but because of what you did. You smoothed it over before the truth had a chance to surface. Soon after, you made a decision that felt harmless at the time. You stopped initiating altogether. You told yourself it was an experiment, a way to see whether the connection would find its way back without you carrying it forward. Days turned into a week, then longer, and the quiet stretched uncomfortably, broken only by brief updates that felt more like check-ins than invitations. You began to realize that your absence wasn't being noticed in the way you had imagined. Instead of prompting closeness, it seemed to settle into the background, reinforcing a pattern where effort flowed in one direction or not at all. That realization sharpened during a family gathering you heard about afterward, mentioned casually in a message, an event you hadn't been invited to, not out of malice but out of assumption. They assumed you'd understand. They assumed you wouldn't mind. And you almost proved them right by responding kindly, telling them it sounded nice, asking questions that kept the conversation comfortable. But once the exchange ended, the weight of that assumption pressed in, because it made something clear you hadn't wanted to admit. Your understanding had become the reason no one checked whether you wanted more. That night, instead of letting the feeling pass, you drafted a message and erased it, then drafted another, each version more careful than the last, until you realized you were editing out the very point. Finally, you sent something simple, not confrontational but unmistakable, a sentence that acknowledged what had happened and how it felt to be left out. The response didn't come quickly. When it did, it was apologetic, well-meaning, and distant, filled with explanations but light on engagement, and that tone landed harder than silence would have. It told you that something had shifted from unspoken distance into managed interaction. You noticed how the days that followed felt different, how communication slowed rather than deepened, how plans became vague again, and how a subtle awkwardness now lived where ease once had. You hadn't caused a conflict, but you had disrupted a pattern, and the disruption revealed how fragile the connection had become. The danger wasn't that you had said too much, it was that you had said enough to make avoidance necessary. And as you sat with that realization, you understood something unsettling. By finally asserting your presence, you had exposed the possibility that the relationship might not stretch to meet you. The question was no longer whether staying agreeable cost too much. It was whether speaking honestly might cost even more, and whether you were prepared to find out which loss you could live with. After that message, the silence didn't disappear, it changed shape, and that change was harder to ignore than the quiet that came before. You noticed it first in the tone, how replies arrived with careful wording, how warmth was present but measured, as if every exchange was being filtered through an unspoken agreement to keep things calm. No one mentioned the message directly, but it hovered over every interaction, a shared awareness that something sensitive had been introduced and quietly set aside. You began to sense that your honesty had been interpreted not as vulnerability, but as discomfort, something to be managed rather than met. A grandchild started checking in with short updates, asking if you were doing okay, a question that sounded kind but landed strangely as if concern had replaced closeness. You answered politely because you didn't know how to correct the narrative without making it worse, and with each exchange you felt your original meaning being slowly rewritten. You hadn't asked for monitoring or reassurance, you had asked to be included, yet the response suggested something else entirely. That misinterpretation became clear during a brief call that felt different from the start. Voices lower, pauses longer, the easy overlap of conversation gone. They spoke carefully, offering explanations you hadn't requested, emphasizing how much they appreciated you, how important you were, and you realized with a quiet shock that your message had been received as a complaint, not an opening. The thought unsettled you because it meant the gap between intention and impact was wider than you had imagined. You found yourself nodding along, affirming their explanations, even as something inside you resisted, aware that by accepting this version of events, you were allowing your silence to be rewritten as satisfaction. After the call, you replayed it not for what was said but for what had been avoided, the way both sides had danced around the real issue, careful not to upset the balance. That carefulness, once appreciated, now felt like distance wearing a polite mask. You noticed how future interactions followed the same pattern, kind, controlled, emotionally shallow, and how quickly this new dynamic settled in. It became easier for them to believe everything was resolved because nothing difficult was being repeated, and harder for you to believe anything had changed at all. You wondered whether this was the cost of speaking up late, that honesty once delayed is easier to reinterpret than respond to directly. The discomfort deepened when you realized others in the family seemed to assume the issue had been handled, their tone relaxed, their expectations reset, as if a private conversation had neatly closed the matter. You felt oddly alone in that assumption, holding an unresolved feeling that no longer had a clear place to go. The silence now carried a story that wasn't yours, one where everything was fine again, and you struggled with the urge to correct it. Each time you considered reopening the conversation, fear returned, not of rejection, but of being seen as someone who couldn't let things go. You understood then that misinterpretation has momentum, and once it starts moving, it's difficult to stop without creating friction. The danger had shifted again, no longer about being overlooked, but about being misunderstood in a way that erased your original need. And as that realization settled, you faced a new, quieter threat. If this version of silence continued unchallenged, it would harden into the truth others believed, leaving you with a choice between correcting it and accepting a closeness that looked peaceful from the outside but felt increasingly hollow from within. What unsettled you most wasn't that the silence returned, it was how easily it settled back in as if it had always belonged there. After the careful calls and tentative check-ins faded, contact reorganized itself into something quieter and more efficient. Brief messages on holidays, casual updates when something notable happened, friendly enough to signal goodwill, distant enough to require no adjustment. No one announced this change. It simply took shape, smooth and unquestioned, like furniture rearranged while you weren't in the room. You noticed it first in the way conversations shifted. A grandchild mentioned upcoming plans in passing, not as an invitation, just as information, and you nodded, smiling even as it registered that inclusion now came after decisions were already made. The tone wasn't unkind. That was part of what made it harder to name. Everything sounded reasonable. Everything made sense. The realization sharpened one evening when a family photo appeared online. Everyone was there, laughing, arms around each other, and you recognized the place immediately. It wasn't the image itself that stung. It was the quiet understanding that no one had thought to tell you about it beforehand. When you asked later carefully, you were met with surprise, then quick explanations. Last-minute plans, assumptions made, no intention to exclude. You believed them because intention had never been the issue. What stayed with you was how naturally the day had unfolded without you, how your absence had fit so cleanly into the story that it hadn't interrupted it at all. After that, you began to notice the pattern everywhere. Conversations referenced shared moments you hadn't been part of. Inside jokes were explained briefly, then left behind. Schedules were discussed without checking yours. You weren't behind, you were adjacent. You learned about their lives after the fact, assembling meaning from fragments, and something in the way you listened changed. You found yourself laughing a second too late, nodding more than speaking, careful not to slow the flow. Without deciding to, you adjusted. You stopped volunteering availability. Stopped mentioning free days. Stopped positioning yourself as someone who could be included easily. It wasn't resentment guiding that shift. It was instinct, the quiet urge to avoid standing in the wrong place again. Each small withdrawal felt sensible, even mature. And that was what made it dangerous. Midway through one ordinary afternoon, the thought arrived fully formed and unwelcome. If you accepted this version of things, no one would ever need to move you back to the center again. There would be no confrontation, no argument to resolve, just a permanent ease built around your absence. The realization wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute. It drew a line you hadn't noticed being crossed. Others seemed relieved by how calm everything had become. They saw harmony. You saw how much that harmony depended on you asking for less and less. The distance had stopped feeling temporary and started feeling structural, built into how plans were made and time was shared. It no longer felt like a phase. It felt like a design. One afternoon, you caught yourself making plans without factoring them in at all. Not out of bitterness, but because it no longer occurred to you to expect overlap. That moment landed harder than you expected. It meant you were shaping your life around an absence that had never been spoken aloud. You hadn't been pushed away. You had been edged out through comfort, through everyone choosing what was easiest, through your own careful cooperation. The most unsettling part was how polite it all was. No one was at fault. No one was wrong. And that meant there was nothing obvious to push against. You sensed that if nothing disrupted this rhythm soon, it would become the reference point, the version of the relationship everyone remembered as normal. Standing there, aware of how effortlessly this arrangement had formed, you understood the real risk. Distance, once normalized, doesn't ask to stay. It only waits for you to accept it, and once you do, it stops feeling temporary forever. The shift didn't announce itself as courage. It arrived as discomfort you could no longer smooth over, a tightness that surfaced each time you almost said something real and then redirected the conversation instead. You began to notice how often you edited yourself before speaking, how quickly you softened statements into harmless observations, how instinctively you protected everyone else from the weight of your truth. That instinct had once felt loving. Now it felt like a habit that was quietly erasing you. The realization struck during an ordinary exchange. A grandchild mentioned an upcoming milestone, casually, almost in passing, and the conversation moved on before you could respond. You felt the familiar urge to let it go, to assume you would hear more later, to trust that inclusion would follow naturally. But something resisted this time. Not anger. Not accusation. Just a steady awareness that if you didn't speak now, you would once again be agreeing to learn about it afterward, from photos or summaries or polite explanations. You opened your mouth, then closed it. The pause was brief, but inside it stretched. In that space you saw the pattern clearly. Every time you chose silence to preserve comfort, you taught others that your absence required no repair. You taught them that you were fine with whatever space remained. That understanding didn't make anyone cruel, but it made the distance reliable. What unsettled you wasn't the fear of upsetting them. It was the fear that saying nothing had become easier than being known. You had spent so long adapting to the edges that stepping forward now felt unfamiliar, almost inappropriate, as if you were breaking an unspoken agreement you didn't remember signing. And yet, the cost of honoring that agreement had become undeniable. Later that day, alone, you replayed the moment repeatedly, not to criticize yourself but to understand it. You realized that silence had stopped being something that happened to you. It had become something you participated in. That thought carried weight. It meant the situation was no longer just about being overlooked. It was about whether you were willing to remain invisible for the sake of peace. You began to imagine what might happen if you didn't soften the next truth. Not a confrontation. Not a speech. Just a sentence that didn't retreat. The idea made your chest tighten. You could already anticipate the responses. Surprise, reassurance, explanations offered quickly to smooth the moment. You wondered if they would truly hear you, or if your words would be absorbed, reinterpreted, and gently set aside like everything else uncomfortable. But another possibility surfaced, quieter yet more insistent. What if nothing changed because you never gave change a chance? What if the version of you they interacted with, agreeable, adaptable, undemanding, was the only one they knew how to respond to anymore? The thought wasn't bitter. It was clarifying. You noticed how often you had mistaken understanding for closeness. Everyone understood you were flexible. Everyone appreciated how easy you were. But understanding hadn't protected you from drifting outward. Ease hadn't kept you central. If anything, it had made your presence optional. That evening, when the phone rang again, you felt the familiar preparation to keep things light. And then you stopped. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was simply a refusal to preemptively disappear. You didn't know yet what you would say, only what you wouldn't do. You wouldn't reassure before being honest, and you wouldn't rush to make things comfortable at your own expense. This wasn't resolve yet. It was proximity to it. A moment where you recognized that silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice with consequences. Standing there, aware of how much had already been shaped by what you hadn't said, you understood that whatever came next would matter. Because the next time you chose quiet, it wouldn't just preserve the distance. It would confirm it. The next conversation arrived sooner than expected, and with it the familiar temptation to delay. There was no perfect moment, no natural opening that invited honesty without risk. Everything about the exchange encouraged normalcy. Updates shared lightly, laughter placed where it belonged, the comfort of routine guiding you toward silence. For a few seconds you considered letting it pass again. After all, nothing was technically wrong. Nothing demanded correction. And yet the weight of what remained unsaid pressed harder than before. When you finally spoke, it wasn't with the force you had imagined in private. It came out steady, almost plain. You didn't accuse. You didn't recount every absence. You said only what could no longer be carried quietly, that you missed being part of their lives in real time, not just in updates after everything had already happened. You left space after the words, resisting the urge to immediately soften them, resisting the reflex to say you understood, that it was fine, that you were just thinking out loud. The silence that followed felt longer than it probably was. Not tense exactly, but unfamiliar. You could sense the mental adjustment on the other end, the recalibration required when someone steps slightly out of the role they've been playing. The response when it came was gentle. There was reassurance. There were explanations. Busy schedules. No intention to create distance. All the things you had predicted. And yet something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, the conversation didn't glide smoothly past your experience. It slowed. Questions were asked, not defensively but cautiously. Had you really felt that way for a while? Why hadn't you said something sooner? You answered honestly, without dramatizing, without minimizing either. You spoke about not wanting to be a burden. About trusting that closeness would return on its own. About how easy it had been to wait too long. What surprised you most wasn't their reaction, it was your own. You didn't feel lighter immediately. You didn't feel relieved. Instead, you felt exposed, as if you had placed something fragile in the open and now had to stand beside it. There was no guarantee it would be handled carefully. That realization carried a quiet fear, but also a strange steadiness. You had done the one thing you could control. You had told the truth without turning it into a demand. The conversation ended politely, warmly even. There were promises to stay in touch, mentions of upcoming plans, suggestions of calling more often. You listened, appreciative but cautious. You had learned how easily intentions could dissolve into habits. Words mattered, but patterns mattered more. Afterward, you sat with the uncertainty. Had you said too much? Not enough? Would this moment register as significant, or would it fade into another well-meaning exchange? The not knowing lingered, uncomfortable but honest. You realized that speaking hadn't solved anything yet. It had simply changed the conditions. Silence was no longer protecting the distance. Now the distance would have to justify itself. In the days that followed, you noticed subtle differences. Messages came sooner. Invitations were mentioned earlier, though not always fully formed. It wasn't a transformation. It was an adjustment, tentative, imperfect. Still, it was movement. And movement mattered more than reassurance ever had. What stayed with you most was the understanding that closeness doesn't return all at once. It tests itself in small ways, watching for resistance, gauging whether the effort will be met halfway. By saying what you did, you had introduced friction into a system that had grown too smooth around your absence. Whether that friction would reshape things or simply settle again remained to be seen. But one truth was clear now. You could no longer claim you were merely waiting. You had stepped forward. Whatever came next, improvement or disappointment, would arrive not from silence but from choice. As you sat with that realization, something shifted from thought into weight. This was no longer about interpreting their intentions or waiting for consistency to arrive on its own. A line had quietly formed and you could feel yourself approaching it. On one side was the version of you who continued adjusting, accepting late invitations, uneven warmth, and partial presence as enough. On the other was the version who stopped compensating for what wasn't being offered. You understood then that the next moment like this would not feel neutral. The next missed call, the next last-minute message, the next gathering you learned about afterward would force a response. Not outwardly but inwardly. You would either step back again, making yourself smaller to preserve peace, or you would do something that could not be undone. Stop showing up as if you were optional. That knowledge tightened your chest. Because once you chose differently, once you stopped translating inconsistency into hope, something fundamental would change. Either the relationship would adjust to meet you, or it would reveal exactly how much space it had truly reserved for you all along. And you knew with unsettling clarity that the decision was no longer abstract. It was coming. The moment arrived quietly, almost disappointingly so. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no clear signal that this was the turning point you had sensed approaching. It came as a familiar message, warm in tone, casual in timing, inviting you into something already half decided. You read it carefully and recognized the pattern immediately. The plan had been shaped without you, and your presence was being added afterward, a courtesy rather than an assumption. Your first instinct surfaced without effort. You knew exactly how to respond in a way that preserved ease. Express appreciation, adjust your schedule, reassure them it was no trouble at all. The words felt practiced, ready. But before sending them, something paused you. Not anger, not pride, just a steady recognition that this response would quietly erase the boundary you had begun to form. You didn't reply right away. The pause itself felt wrong at first, like neglecting a responsibility. You told yourself you were busy, that you'd answer later, but beneath that was a choice you could feel taking shape. You were allowing the moment to remain unresolved. You were resisting the urge to immediately restore comfort. When you finally responded, the message was simple. You thanked them for thinking of you. You said you wouldn't be able to make it this time. You didn't apologize excessively. You didn't offer another date. You didn't soften the refusal with explanations. You let the sentence stand as it was, complete, calm, and unaccommodating. The reply came hours later. It was polite, brief, and what stood out most was what it didn't contain. There was no, "Are you sure?" No suggestion to adjust the plan. No follow-up question. The invitation did not reopen, it simply closed. The space you had left remained exactly where it was. That absence clarified more than any argument could have. You understood then that your flexibility had been doing more work than you realized. Making it easy had never secured closeness. It had only ensured convenience. By not compensating this time, you hadn't created distance. You had revealed how much distance already existed. In the days that followed, you noticed the shift most clearly in moments that used to pull you into action. A silence stretched longer than usual. Normally, you would have filled it with a message, a check-in, a gentle reminder of your presence. This time you didn't. You watched the urge rise and pass. Nothing collapsed. Nothing rushed to replace what you withheld. That contrast stayed with you. You began to see how often you had been maintaining momentum alone, mistaking motion for mutual effort. Without your constant adjustment, the rhythm changed. Some connections slowed. Others continued without hesitation. The difference was impossible to ignore. There was grief in that recognition. Not loud or dramatic but sharp in its honesty. You saw that certain forms of closeness had depended on you being endlessly available, endlessly adaptable. Letting go of that role meant accepting that some things might not return to what they once were. And that loss, potential, unspoken, irreversible, settled quietly in your chest. But alongside the grief was relief. You were no longer negotiating your worth through patience. You were no longer trying to earn inclusion by making yourself easy to overlook. As the days passed without repair or escalation, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever remained would now exist without your constant effort holding it together. And whatever faded would do so not because you withdrew love, but because love, without intention on both sides, could not survive on accommodation alone. For the first time, you weren't waiting to be noticed. You were watching what chose to notice you back. The answer didn't arrive as a conversation. It didn't come wrapped in clarity or explanation. It revealed itself slowly through what continued, and what didn't, once you stopped holding everything in place. Days passed without the familiar reach out. A week slipped by where updates arrived only when there was something to announce, not something to share. The rhythm had changed and no one commented on it. That, more than anything, told you what you needed to know. You noticed it first in the absence of small things. The casual check-ins faded. The light questions, asked simply because someone thought of you, became rare. You weren't excluded deliberately. You were simply no longer necessary to the flow of things. Life moved forward smoothly, efficiently, without needing your presence to stabilize it. The quiet truth settled in. When you stopped making it easy, no one rushed to make it mutual. There was a moment, small, ordinary, that confirmed it. You learned about a gathering after it had already happened. Not with discomfort or apology, but with the casual tone reserved for things assumed to be understood. You listened, nodded, even smiled. And inside, something closed, not in bitterness but in recognition. This wasn't a temporary oversight. This was the shape of the relationship once accommodation was removed. What surprised you was not how much it hurt but how cleanly it clarified things. You had spent so long questioning your expectations, wondering if you were asking too much, if you should simply be grateful for what remained. Now, without effort masking reality, the answer stood on its own. You were welcome but not essential. Loved but not centered. Remembered but not prioritized. The grief that followed was different from what you had imagined. It wasn't explosive or overwhelming. It was steady, like a low tide pulling something familiar away. You mourned not just what was, but what you had quietly hoped might still return if you waited long enough. The version of closeness that existed only when you made yourself endlessly available was not coming back. And naming that truth, though painful, was also freeing. You began to see how much emotional labor you had been contributing, anticipating needs, adjusting expectations, absorbing disappointment privately so others wouldn't have to. Without that labor, the imbalance became visible. You realized that love alone could not sustain connection. It required intention, effort, and willingness from both sides. Without those, affection remained, but intimacy thinned. And yet, something unexpected happened alongside the loss. Your days grew quieter but also steadier. You no longer waited for signals or replayed conversations, searching for meaning. The uncertainty that had once kept you alert softened. You were no longer bracing for inclusion or exclusion. You were simply present in your own life again. You noticed how your energy returned to places where it was met without effort. Conversations where you weren't careful. Moments where your presence wasn't conditional. The contrast was unmistakable. You hadn't lost the capacity for closeness. You had reclaimed it from a place that could not hold it well. The answer, when it finally arrived, wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. It showed you what the relationship could sustain without sacrifice from one side alone. And once you saw that, you stopped negotiating with reality. You didn't stop caring. You didn't close your heart. But you did stop bending yourself to fit into a space that had grown comfortable without you. You allowed love to exist without chasing it into places where it could not follow. Standing there, with clarity instead of hope doing the work, you understood something essential. Not every distance is meant to be crossed. Some are meant to be recognized, respected, and released. And in that release, you didn't lose your place. You finally stopped trying to earn it,